Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And I want to start by talking about federal labeling laws and why this strategy just is hopeless and we got to drop it already. And I'll just start by saying anytime a legislative body passes a law or a government agency writes a rule or regulation, there are unintended consequences, and most of the time those consequences are negative. And I've sat in my share of legislative hearings where people come in and start talking about a law that got passed and nobody realized this whole group of people over here were going to be hurt by it. So I've had firsthand experience with this, and sometimes the bad stuff that happens due to unintended consequences are worse than the good things that are supposed to happen as a result of creating a new law or writing a rule or regulation. So in my mind, it's an argument for less government and less involvement in government in our lives. So I'll give you a good example. There's quite a bit of debate. I'll be talking about this. I've talked about it before, and I will be talking about it again in the future, about the FDA's proposals for changing labeling laws. I really don't think that this is going to make much difference. One of the reasons being that research shows that people really don't make their decisions so much in response to those nutrition facts labels on the back of the package. And most of what they're talking about, in my opinion, is just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic and further expression of the ineptitude that's already there. I mean, by focusing on a handful of nutrients, I think it leads people to believe that single nutrients are important as opposed to whole foods, and I could go on and on about that. But according to several experts, and the ineptitude I want to talk about today, the FDA is looking at changing how serving sizes are calculated, and this may actually lead to people eating more instead of less, an unintended consequence of the change, which is they're saying basically the serving size needs to reflect what people will actually eat. So I don't know how many packages you've looked at and if you've looked at the serving size, but it's not uncommon for a serving size to be a half a muffin, a half a candy bar, a half a bagel. Well, you know what? People don't usually eat a half a muffin and a half a candy bar and a half of a bagel. They usually eat the whole thing. So the problem is that, and what these experts are basically saying, is that if you put the whole in actual serving, we're going to make it the whole bagel, the whole candy bar, the whole muffin, half of customers and consumers think that the serving size is the recommended amount to eat by the government. So what they're afraid of is it'll encourage people to eat even more. And so you can just see the silliness in this debate back and forth. It takes up so much time and it distracts from the real issue, and none of it results in improving public health. How about a discussion about not eating the muffin? That's what we really should be talking about. How about not having the candy bar and having an apple instead? How about not eating the whole bagel, which is, you know, the serving sizes of these things are 600 and 700 calories now, and eating whole foods instead. So I get a lot of inquiries about, you know, what do you think about the FDA's proposed rules, and doesn't this look like an improvement? And actually, I don't think so. I mean, this whole discussion on half a muffin, whole muffin, and consumers thinking the government thinks that they should eat a whole muffin, to me, it's like a skit from Saturday Night Live. We need to quit this stuff and start talking about something that's really meaningful to consumers, which is how they can improve their health with substantive dietary change. So I'll have some more to say about this. This isn't the only silliness going on with this whole issue, but I'm for taking this stuff off the package. Let's forget about it already. And while we're on the topic of packaged foods, I want to talk about folic acid. And you know, here in the United States, we fortify foods. There's mandatory fortification for certain types of foods, and in other countries, the issue isn't quite so clear-cut, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not to do it. So I thought it might be interesting to just start at the beginning about folic acid and fortification and folate, and tell you what's going on in the UK right now, which I think is kind of interesting. So research has shown that the incidence of neural tube defects is related to folate deficiency. Notice I didn't say folic acid deficiency. In 1998, the Institute of Medicine recommended that women of childbearing age consume 400 micrograms per day of folic acid in supplements, fortified foods, or both, in addition to the folate that they consume in a normal diet. And when we get to which foods consume folate, it's easy to see how many people, based on the way they eat today, probably don't take it enough, although it's easy to do it. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force at the same time issued similar recommendations. Now, in order to make sure that women take in the recommended amount, 53 countries currently have some type of regulation for mandatory fortification of wheat flour with folic acid. The World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations have published guidelines recommending the same thing. In 1996, fortification of enriched cereal grain products with folic acid was made mandatory, and the guidelines are for 140 micrograms of folic acid per 100 grams of enriched cereal grain product. And advocates of this say that this is one of the best public policy initiatives in terms of improving public health that's ever happened. Now, the background, it's amazing how often people take credit for things they had nothing to do with, all right? So the rate of neural tube birth defects had been declining for many years before. It was low at the time that the folic acid mandate was issued. So it's really difficult to attribute any improvement to mandatory fortification. Additionally, while folic acid has been shown to reduce neural tube defects, which result in deformities of the spinal cord by 50%, that 50% is expressed in relative rather than absolute terms. And this is a very important point. The risk of neural tube defects is 2 in 1,000 for women who don't take folic acid, and 1 in 1,000 for women who do. That's a 50% reduction in relative terms, but only a 1% reduction in absolute terms. A woman who takes folic acid during pregnancy reduces the risk of neural tube defects by only 1%. And those numbers are for the general population, most of whom are not practicing dietary excellence. Now, folic acid comes from folate, which is found naturally in plants. And so if you're eating a plant-based diet, you don't develop a folate deficiency. And by way of example, I'll just give you some common foods and how much folate they have. So we're trying to get 400 micrograms a day. That's the recommended daily intake. A half a cup of frozen spinach has 100 micrograms. A half a cup of Great Northern beans has 90 micrograms. 4 asparagus spears, 85 micrograms. By the way, have any of you ever eaten 4 asparagus spears? I mean, I usually eat like a dozen or more. A half a cup of broccoli. I usually eat a pound of it, 50 micrograms. So you get the idea. You're not going to be folate deficient if you're eating the right diet. And there are risks associated with taking in larger amounts of folic acid instead of folate from food, which can be hard to justify when it is so easy to get the right amount of folate from food. Now, I'll come back to what I said earlier. This discussion is going on in the United Kingdom right now. So according to researchers at the Institute of Food and the Newcastle University, the folate from food is metabolized differently in the body than folic acid in its synthetic version. The result is unmetabolized folic acid circulating in the bloodstream, which eventually has to be disposed of through the liver. The researchers wrote that 86% of folic acid in the hepatic portal vein, which carries blood from the GI tract to the liver, wasn't metabolized, while almost all the naturally occurring folate was. In other words, naturally occurring nutrients from food are processed differently by the body than synthetic nutrients in pills and fortified foods. Now, the excess folic acid can cause side effects, including compromised immune function, masking B12 deficiencies, and even an increased risk of cancer. The UK is currently considering whether or not to mandate folic acid fortification at this time, like we do here in the United States. In reference to this issue, the lead researcher in the study that I just mentioned stated in an interview that if fortification is necessary, and he's not necessarily convinced that it is, it would be better to use the natural form of the vitamin than its synthetic form, folic acid. An even better alternative, start eating the foods I mentioned. How about some spinach, some beans, some asparagus, some broccoli? Center your diet around those foods. You won't have to worry about fortified foods with folic acid. All right, that's all for today and for this week. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it. Have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend.